and work on important and interesting issues, both applied and educational. We would like to increase discussion and collaboration between data scientists and across a variety of disciplines. So not only statistics, not only mathematics, but also applied sciences. RS, so the seminar is a partnership between Department of Statistical Sciences at the University of Toronto and CANC, Ontario, and its partner universities. And this list of partner universities includes Brock University, Carleton University, Wilfrid Laurier, McMaster's, Queen's, Guelph, of course, Toronto, Waterloo, Windsor, Western University, York University, and last but not least, my home institution, University of Ottawa. So now it's time to introduce the speaker. So Luk Arbuckle, he is, I would say, right now a leading figure in the data privacy in Canada, both in terms of methodology and I would say right now also legal aspects. I had the privilege to be his master's supervisor, which was done on a completely different topic than data privacy. Because before meeting Luk, I didn't know anything about data privacy. And I think I still don't know too much. Nevertheless, so we did master thesis, and then on a completely different topic. When he went to work in the industry, he spent some time in the CHIO, which is Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, as data scientist or as biostatistician. Then he got involved into data privacy aspects. And right now, he has a couple of different heads after working at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, so the legal entity that creates some privacy laws in Canada. Right now, he has two positions, and maybe it's better that you say exactly what kind of positions you have. He works for a private industry, and we are running a couple of MyTax projects, and many of my students are involved in these MyTax projects to develop statistical framework for data privacy. So I will give you the floor. So please, Luk, go ahead.
Thank you, Rafa. So hello, everyone. Now I'm assuming the camera's not on, correct? So, or people can see me? No? Okay, so I apologize for those who can't see me, for those who are here in the room today, but if you were here, you'll see that I tend to wave my arms around a lot, so I may get a little winded at sometimes, but that's just the nature of how I speak. So as Raphael said, I work at Privacy Analytics, but Privacy Analytics is actually an IQVIA company, so I have two roles. So one of them is at Privacy Analytics as the chief methodologist. So what I do along with my crack team, Devyani Biswal, we look at the methodologies behind how do we make data safe, data and statistics safe. So all the methods, all the science behind how we evaluate things like anonymization is one big factor, but even more broadly than that, synthetic data, private statistics, we deal with some legal aspects as well. Now, we're not lawyers, we are technologists. My background is engineering. Then I did signal and image processing, and I did a second master's degree in statistics. So it's varied and mixed, but because I worked at the Privacy Commissioner's office, I work with lawyers and policymakers, and that's sort of part of my role now. Now, the IQVIA side of things, IQVIA, for those of you who don't know, it's a very, very large company in bioinformatics. So they call themselves the human data science company, human data science, that's what it is. So basically they work with things like Health Canada, the FDA, pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, and very much in the biostatistics, bioinformatics realm of things. So clinical trials, I'll hopefully at the end of this, I'll actually get to some of those examples to talk a little bit about what our role is. But what Devian and I do as well for IQVIA is look at that broader landscape of AI science, for example. So what are the risks in using AI? What does it mean for the biostatistician that's receiving this data that's potentially got AI somewhere in the middle, or these statistics, right? What does that do to the data or the results? So it's kind of a broad remit, and we do a lot of other things as well, but it's just to give you a sort of a bigger view of, you know, what we do. So I should point out, you probably noticed from the presentation, very nice corporate logos and all that, there will be no equations in this presentation, okay? I want to make that very clear. If I presented an equation, we'd end up spending the entire presentation on one topic. Whereas what I'd like to do is give you a much broader view and sort of the why behind, all the statistics that we use in our business. Okay, both on the privacy side, but also in that broader sort of, as I'm calling it, trustworthy AI. Okay, so this is a basic outline of what we're going to talk about. So one, in terms of AI modeling, I'm not going to assume any prior knowledge because this topic of AI uses a different language, something we'll talk maybe a little bit more about later on. I didn't want to assume that anyone had prior knowledge in that terminology. Okay, you might already, and that's great, but just bear with me as we go through some of this, and particularly want to focus on some of the risks with these different modeling approaches. Okay, at a high level, just to give you some broad strokes. Then we'll do a little divergence into regulations. As I mentioned, or as Raphael mentioned, I work for the Privacy Commissioner's Office at the federal level. And so I worked on the legal policy side, and there's a lot of new regulations coming, both in Canada. The AI Act is part of this broader bill oh boy, I'm going to get the number wrong. C26, I don't know, some C anyway. It's currently being debated now. It has both a privacy component and an AI component, okay? So we'll talk a little bit about that, but not actually in the Canadian context, but in the broader world context. So European is a big one. If you're familiar with privacy side of things, the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, very influential. They're now putting forward an AI regulation, which is also going to be very influential, okay? So I'll look at that. We'll talk a little bit about other countries as well to get sort of a view of what regulators are saying. And in particular, I'm going to focus in on the healthcare space, okay? So what is the European Medicines Agency saying, for example? That's going to be part of this topic because it's going to sort of give you, I hope, some insight into interesting areas for statisticians in general. And then hopefully, if we have enough time, I'll go into some examples. This is kind of a pivot, but again, I want to focus on the why this matters. There's one slide in particular just before that, early examples that I think I could spend probably most of this talk, but we'll see how things go, see how much I babble on, and we'll see how it takes from there. Okay, so the outcome we're looking for, and I did pivot a little bit from the original abstract because I do want to give you that broader view, and it would take too long to go into specific modeling approaches, but ultimately want people to kind of see, what is the motivation for AI governance? So again, those risks, why do we need regulation anyway for AI? I mean, isn't AI just statistics ultimately, but maybe, a little bit souped up? Learn about some of the emerging regulations and guidelines, and then in particular, the role of statistics. When I mention trustworthiness, what does that mean? Where does statistics play a role? Okay, so a very broad definition, okay? Artificial intelligence, what is it? This is an ISO, International Standards Organization definition. The capability to acquire, process, create, and apply knowledge held in the form of a model to conduct one or more given tasks. Very generic, okay? But the key thing here for us probably is the model piece, okay? Very simple, right? Process-wise. We're taking in data, we're building some kind of algorithm that's going to build a model about the world, and then from there, it's going to produce results. It's simple, but it's effective in terms of we start looking at these risks. Where are the risks? What are the concerns? They actually focus on different pieces of this very, very simple process, okay? We can look at the data coming in. Is it appropriate data? Was it anonymized? Is it biased? We can look at the process in terms of, the application of that AI. Well, do I have permission to use this AI algorithm on this data set? But also, what risks does it entail? Like, what does that AI model do? What does it give me in terms of outputs? Can I trust it? Again, trust is a key theme here. And then finally, the outputs. What is it doing? How do I use that? What sort of human oversight do I have? Okay, so I'm not going to make people ask, but in general, just think about what are the risks from AI. So I'm assuming people here are familiar with ChatGPT. I've had some conversation with some students already that are using it really interesting ways to make sure that they're coming up with good questions. The students can't just pump into ChatGPT. So it's a form of risk, right? People misusing, let's say, the tools that are available to them. But let me just give you a list, a sample. I tried to pick the ones that there's many, but I tried to pick the ones that kind of related to our topic as statisticians, okay? So I mentioned the data, I mentioned the outputs, right? What about bias? First thing you think of, what kind of representation do I have in the fundamental data set that I'm feeding into this model? If I feed nothing but white males into that data set, the model is not going to predict for anyone but white males, or not well anyway. It's going to be biased. We have issues then of discrimination, right? If we're using this AI to predict, I don't know, let's say insurance premiums, right? You want to make sure that it's non-discriminatory. So these are all different kinds of risks. Fairness, explainability is another one, unexplainability. I don't know what this black box is doing. ChatGPT is giving me code, our code. Well, I don't know how it got there, but looks good to me, you know, that could be a major concern. Now, again, think of it from a regulatory perspective as well, but think of it in terms of your research as a statistician, right? Can you trust what it's giving you? Can you use this input? Okay, so you'll see a few more, for those of you who can see the screen now. Robustness, privacy violations, privacy analytics, obviously that's one of the areas we're concerned with. We have adversarial attacks, right? That's partly security, partly privacy, depends what they're attacking for. What are they trying to do? Are they trying to take that model and uncover the underlying data set? That's a real concern. There's all kinds of other sort of attacks that can exist, but we won't go into all those details. I mentioned misuse already. Concept drift, right? Does the model still work a month, 3 months from now, right? Again, depending on what you're using it for. So these are all kinds of different risks that regulators think about. So now what I'll do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the different modeling approaches, again, assuming no prior knowledge in terms of computer science and the language that they use, and then talk a little bit about some of the risks behind those. Again, very high level, just an introduction to make sure everyone's on the same page. So remember my very, very simple diagram. We ingest some data, we build a model, and we output something. Okay, that's classical machine learning. So there's 3 general categories. So we have some data that's labeled, right? We have apples and oranges. So pictures, for example. We have age, we have race, we have income, right? It's all labeled data. So when I'm feeding it some kind of supervised learning model, well, I'm supervised because I've told it what it has to learn, okay? Pretty simple. So we're basically minimizing the error between what we're trying to predict and what's seen in the data. Then we'll have some unlabeled data and we'll just throw some stuff at it and see, well, can you do something with this? I'm going to throw you pictures of apples and oranges, but not tell you it's an apple and an orange, right? Pretty simple, unsupervised learning. And then reinforcement learning, states and actions. So think of a robot, you know, navigating around the building, for example, okay? So these are very effective models. They're used all the time in all kinds of different scenarios. And ultimately, they are based on statistical principles. I mean, it's like supervised is just regression or classification. Oh, that's weird. I think I screwed up my, did you PDF the right presentation?
Yeah.
Weird. Okay. All right. We'll go with that. Oh, I know. Maybe it's coming up. Okay. It's coming up. That's why. So supervised is basically regression and classification, right? Simple version of this. Unsupervised is clustering and density estimation. Reinforcement learning is just dynamic programming. That'd be like just some generic words that hopefully make a little more sense for those who aren't familiar with this topic. Okay. All right. So the risks here, there are several. So, you know, you've seen it previously. So there's rigorous testing, there is evaluation, validation, all the stuff that we learn. Well, hopefully you're learning in your courses on, you know, GLMs or whatever. But there's other things that are done. For example, it's something called model risk management. If you're in the finance space, you might be familiar with this, but we'll have this at IQVIA, for example. We'll have an inventory of different modeling approaches and say which ones are appropriate where, because there's some things that's like, no, you can't use that. That's not permissible, okay? Because the errors are too far off, because it doesn't produce good results for whatever reasons, okay? It's much more regulated in the financial space in terms of which models to use where, but that's the basic idea. There'll also be, of course, monitoring and reassessment, make sure your model's still applicable in a year's time, right? So all pretty straightforward stuff. Now, the thing I wanted to draw your attention to, and I'm going to do this again, is in the healthcare space, okay? Some of this, like you're using ChatGPT, well, I don't care. It spits out text and it's a perfect abstract for my conference presentation. Good, right? That's good enough. But when you start talking about patient safety, so I'm going to come back to this example later on, but let's say biopharmaceutical, I'm creating a new drug, right? I want to make sure that drug is safe. So now the regulators get involved, and it's not enough to say I'm using AI. Okay, they're very, very rigorous testing, very rigorous in terms of how the data has been controlled, because I don't want to make sure that's not being manipulated anyway. So the data set has to be traced. There's all kinds of governance around that. And then the statistics that they actually do on it to prove efficacy, to prove safety. Okay, so we'll come back to this again later on. There's an ethical piece as well, but I'll focus a little bit less on that. It's less mathy. Okay, so neural networks and deep learning. Who here in the room knows deep learning method, like from a mathematical perspective? Few people? Okay, good, excellent. So this is like a classic diagram, and you'll see all kinds of these. You'll have these really cool, you can search them, you can find these really good cheat sheets of all the different ways they can connect all these nodes together, and it'll produce a different type of learning model. So it learns certain things better. Some are good for images, some are good for time series, okay? I saw a really cool paper a few months ago, and it was, they were trying to model, again, I want to be very clear, this is not a good representation of the brain, but it works. It gives us something to kind of latch onto and say, okay, cool. So they took the sort of neurobiology behind, I think it was like a sea worm or something, and they used that to go, oh, I need something that can do time series basically, but I don't need it to be ChatGPT. I just need it to be very quick because I want to put it in a robot. And they used sort of the neural sort of image they had, and they literally took this math and kind of chained things together in a certain way, and they had this new AI that they could use for certain tasks, and it performed really, really well. Kind of cool, okay? So conceptually though, what is this? Ultimately, you can think of each one of these nodes as, whoa, my screen disappeared. Okay, as a regression. So even better, think of it as a generalized linear model or a generalized linear mixed model. So pretty cool. So now you think about each one of these nodes, you go, okay, I can understand that. As a statistician, you can go in, start learning the math, and the hard part, I'll tell you because I've done it, is you look at the math and you go, how do I translate this into statistical mathematical language? That is a challenge, okay? Quite frankly, they don't tell you it's a GLM or a GLMM. So you got to do a little homework. But now think about this. Each one of these nodes is, I'm going to call it regression for sake of a simple word, okay? Chained together. I mean, that's pretty cool, but also complex. Like, think about it. They have, in some cases, like hundreds of these connected together in all kinds of fancy ways. Now think about what the statistical properties of that. Think about the inference, right? This is complicated stuff, okay? But again, the challenge is they're constantly changing these algorithms. They're creating new ways to network them together. ChatGPT is a great example of that. They use this term attention, right? I won't get into the specifics. It's cool though, but it's basically a weighting matrix that's being used to say, focus your learning here. So it's math, but they use words that help sort of innovate, let's say, because if you think about it, you start to go, okay, so this means attention. This means learning. This means this. You can start to see how you can kind of motivate new ways to connect all these pieces together and develop new things. But what does that mean statistically? Big open question in most cases, okay? Lots of cool stuff happening here, but there's still also a lot of statistics that have to be derived. Okay, so now there are new risks, and you've probably heard about many of these already. Tons of data is being used, okay? If you read anything about ChatGPT, it's using terabytes of data. The learning process takes a ton of time, a ton of resources, right? There's concerns now of carbon capture and all this kind of stuff because of something like this, just crunching so much data, okay? But on top of that, now there are the privacy concerns. There's copyright concerns, right? You're taking all this data from the internet, but it's copyrighted, or it might be my personal blog posts. I never intended it to train a model. Then we get into the complexity of this because of all these things chained together. I don't really know what it's giving me at the output. Now, with ChatGPT, you can read it and say, okay, it seems relevant, it seems useful. But when I look at something a little more mathy, like financial risk modeling, what is it telling me? Can I trust this value that's coming out of it? Concern from the regulatory perspective is the fact that they can't look at this model. I can't tell them in very simple terms, oh, it's a regression. Draw a line through the data and you're good. I can't do that anymore, right? This model is very, very complex. Obviously, there's some IP around it, but even at a simple sort of neural network, you look at the literature, like you can't expect a regulator who, by the way, is going to be a lawyer or a policy person who don't necessarily have technical backgrounds. They're trying to understand this. That's challenging, okay? Now, those issues of bias. Let's say you're doing this to give out car loans, for example. Well, how do I know my car loan that was rejected was fair, right? So there's big concerns about how these things are being used. That's why you hear about human oversight. And then what if you're taking, as a researcher, you take an external publicly available model and you start using it, right? Well, I don't know how this model was developed. I don't know what data set it was trained on. I don't know if it's breaching privacy concerns. So the Treasury Board Secretariat at the Canadian federal level, they've produced some recent draft guidance on Gen AI. And these are some of the issues they talk about. If you're going to start using these tools, do you know that it's not infringing copyright? Do you know that it's not infringing on people's privacy? On top of all the practical use cases of, well, is this biased? Is it going to, are we going to make a decision to a Canadian that is unfair, right? All these things come up. And I mentioned I would do this again, healthcare. So again, now you're talking about if you're going to use this kind of modern approach, what does that mean for patient safety? How do I evaluate this? Do I just evaluate the outputs and say, well, if the outputs seem, accurate enough, that's good, right? There's ethical concerns as well. How was the model trained? Is it appropriate to be using it, et cetera? Okay, so I've used the word trustworthiness a few times now. So I want you to think for a second here. It'll just be the reverse to a large extent. I talked about risks. What's trust? So word cloud. So we've got things that are valid, reliable, safe, secure, resilient, accountable, lots of words, okay? From a statistical standpoint, obviously our interest is going to be a lot of those things like reliability and safety, right? Again, think in terms of like healthcare, right? Big concerns there. We want to avoid bias. So we want something that's unbiased. It says bias. Oh, bias mitigation. Sorry, there was another word there. Validation, confidentiality, lots of things that we're thinking about, okay? All right, so little diversion now. We did the little intro part. Let's talk about some of the regulations. And again, I'm going to focus in on healthcare specifically because I think it really makes the point and it's going to help when we get to the end of this. Okay, so there's a whole bunch. Obviously, I'm not going to speak to all of them. I'm going to give you 3 basic sort of jurisdictions and kind of what's happening at a high level just to get you kind of thinking about this. Okay, so in the US, we have the FTC. So they're looking, again, trustworthy AI. There's been several cases. If this is something you're following, you'll know about certain cases where sort of the stick that they use is if you're doing something that's unfair and they say this is not okay, and they find out that you're using data you shouldn't, they're going to say, well, then you can't have this model. And in some cases, this has literally shut down companies, okay? Because they said you weren't allowed to train that model on this data. That was not appropriate. Hence, you have to delete the model because the model is tied to the data. That's a big deal for a company that does nothing but analytics, let's say, okay? So that's a big stick. Now they have what's called a 3-factor test, significance of injury, benefits greater than harms, and avoidable. This is what they're looking at when they're looking at unfairness. Another important one I mentioned, I'm going to mention this again, in terms of healthcare and drug development. The FDA has proposed a software as a medical device framework, and they've been talking about regulating AI. So far it's just drafts. They had a draft paper. I think this was the 2nd iteration of it, where they put it out there, people could read about it and see what are they talking about AI. And I'm going to come back to this one because this is actually really, really important to what I want to get to. Okay, another one is in the UK. So you have what's called, I mentioned I was, Privacy Commissioner's Office at the federal level. They have the Information Commissioner's Office, same role, okay, Data Protection Authority. They're using the current existing regulations. So the data, well, actually, they're no longer part of the EU, but anyway, they have a very similar privacy regulation where they're looking at it and say, okay, we're going to interpret, and they did this quite a while ago, in fact. They said, let's apply this to AI. And how can we sort of take what's already existing in terms of privacy and say, well, okay, this applies to AI. So transparency being a classic one. Okay, I need to understand this model. You have to be transparent that you're telling, you're talking to a real person right now, not a chatbot. Okay, things like that. There's a thing called PETS, so privacy enhancing technology. So if you've ever heard the terms, some of the students have now, differential privacy, right? This mathematical formulation. This is where Rafael and I have been working together for a while now. And there's other PETs as well, but that's one. I'll talk about a bit more maybe later on. They've produced some code of conduct on AI. This is for the National Health Service, so big deal. Again, this is really focusing in on health. And there's some other things where you basically have to register your software as a medical device and get some sort of conformance mark to say, yes, it's private, it's safe, et cetera. And this is becoming much more detailed as we start looking at AI, like in writ large, the neural networks. ChatGPT really revolutionized sort of their view around this regulation. And the last one, General Data Protection Regulation, that's the EU. Same kind of idea, looking at responsible uses of data. There's EU ethics guidelines. There is a committee that looked at this and have produced some things. Interestingly enough is the new code of practice with the US, which I think is quite, let's say, at the forefront because they recognize they need to work together. They recognize they're both using a lot of data. If they coordinate, then they'll have more influence. And then finally, there's the AI Act. This is basically, I won't go into the details of this, but it's basically a risk-based framework to say, well, you know, if you're doing a chatbot, well, just let people know it's a chatbot, not a real person. Okay, great. But then it gets into higher risk uses. Okay, so there's things like if you're doing software as a medical device, well, that's higher risk now. Okay, so there's going to be more scrutiny on that. You're going to need, you know, risk assessments. You're going to need a lot more things proving that it's safe, essentially. And I'll come back to that point. And then last category of things they say you're not allowed to do, no social scoring in the EU. That's a big no-no. Okay. Okay, this is the part that I think is the most exciting, especially as statisticians. Okay. I think it was in July that the European Medicines Agency produced a draft. It's only 15 pages, I think 15-ish, on basically using AI, but and product life cycle. In other words, I'm developing a drug that people are going to take, right? Or it doesn't have to be a drug, but medicinal product is what they call it. But I'm using AI in some way. Now, obviously, language is important here. What do you mean by AI? Is it supervised learning? Is it a regression? Oh, we've been doing this forever. We know how to deal with that. We know how to set the standards. We know how to look at statistical inference. But they're looking at it at a broader perspective of any AI, especially, you know, these neural networks, right? What do we have to look at? What do we have to consider? What is going to be the regulation going forward to ensure that these things, these drugs, these medicinal products are still safe? And this is where the statistics really starts to come through. So I could spend literally an hour on just this one slide. There's 3 parts to it. But here's what I pulled out of that draft that I thought was the most interesting. Okay. The first one is, I've already kind of hinted at it. Okay. I'm a biostatistician. I'm looking at drug development. I'm looking at clinical trials. I suddenly use some AI model that's black box, not ChatGPT, but something a little more specific where it's crunching numbers for me, let's say. What is it doing to my statistical inference? Okay, how do I know if I insert this machine learning algorithm that's been developed for computer science that works really well in theory, but how do I know that my endpoints, my safety measures, et cetera, that those are still working? So privacy analytics, we do, you know, things like I mentioned, anonymization, synthetic data, for example. And when we started working with pharma companies, it was the first thing they asked, hey, you're changing our data to make it safe and non-personal. Okay, great. But how's that going to affect my statistics? And they had to know every change to the data, every distribution that was being used, so they could tweak their R code to make sure everything was lined up properly. Okay, so this is actually a really big deal because you're now inserting something that may be a black box into this process. How are you going to evaluate it? Are we going to evaluate it based on some framework of the outputs, right? Let's just evaluate the outputs, not work. Well, we have the inputs, we have the outputs. I don't know what's going on in the middle. That's a pretty big change, to be honest, the way they currently do things, but it's possible. And this is the question they're asking, right? How are you going to check to make sure this thing you've done hasn't changed my statistical inference, right? I say I have these standard errors. Oh, not anymore. I don't know anymore, right? Big question. Another one that I thought was really interesting is they have a little section on augmentation. So they're taking a data set. So let's say it's a clinical trial, okay? And I decide I want to get a little bit more data to get statistical significance. So I just add a bunch of fake data. Now, there are ways that are already valid, that are already being used in the pharma space. But here we're really starting to talk about synthetic data generation. So bootstrap replacement, we know how to deal with this. But if you take some generalized adversarial network model, again, okay, which is a neural network model, and I generate some data. So now I don't know anymore where the statistics are. I just start feeding it more data. And I've had people tell me they've done this for some competition. Say, oh, now I got statistical significance. And I'm thinking, of what though? I don't know if that works. Like, it's very confusing to me that you can just add fake data and suddenly claim I have enough data to have statistical significance. So I think this is an interesting problem. You're seeing more and more. I talked to biostatisticians at this pharma company, and the first thing they said was, where are the latent variables? You've taken this data set, you've created a new data set. In some cases, they're replacing, by the way, it's not just augmentation. They replace the entire data set with synthetic. Who needs a control arm, right? I have the people that I'm applying the drug to. I'm going to create a synthetic data set in which I'm going to say that's the control. That is the people who are not getting the drug. And I'm going to do this comparison and say it's safe. Whoa, or maybe efficacious would be a better term in this case. But how do I know that synthetic data kept all of those relationships. Those latent variables are now maybe gone. And there is some math behind this. There are some methods that are trying to inject latent variable modeling into the process, but very, very early days, and not a lot of statisticians involved in really solving these problems. Yet, anyway. I have high hopes for us. And the last one I've already kind of mentioned is the privacy side, okay? So we can anonymize the data. We can use differential privacy. Does differential privacy work in this circumstance? And that, there's a lot of questions around that. New papers coming out that are kind of questioning the basis for how we use differential privacy. If you don't know, it doesn't matter. The basic premise is I'm going to pull you out of a database and I'm going to see if pulling you out of the database changes the final statistic. If it does, then maybe I add a little bit of noise so I can't tell you're in that statistic or not. That's the high level view of what differential privacy is. But it comes from cryptography, information theory. And so it uses different tools, different language. This is where Rafael and I have spent a lot of time with Devyani trying to understand, well, what does this mean statistically? What are they doing? What are they saying? Is it correct? Is it not correct? How do we improve on it? Okay. Our interest was in first ensuring that the statistics were valid and useful, and then adding privacy, right? Not privacy first, utility first, but adding privacy to that. Big topic, okay? Synthetic data, same thing. I already mentioned some of the synthetic data stuffs. And then there's inserting some of these methods into the statistic instead of the data, right? That's the way I just described differential privacy. That's how it was devised, but it's been used for data sets as well. So now you're getting these mixed worlds where maybe you have like 4 different neural networks chained together. I know I add differential privacy at the gradient descent, but not in the next one level. How do I add the differential privacy? It gets messy. If you're not familiar, it doesn't matter. The point is there's a lot of really cool math to be developed in this space, okay? So to me, this is really interesting. It all comes back together because it all comes back to inference. If I'm going to add noise to a data set to make it private or a statistic, I want to make sure my statistical inference is still correct, okay? That's a big, big issue. Same thing with synthetic. You're going to suddenly throw out the data set and throw in a synthetic data set. I want to make sure that this is still valid, right? Again, think, in this case, European Medicines Agency, right? They're dealing with medicines. Very, very important topic. Lots of curious, there's some really interesting stuff as well from, I didn't mention specifically, just earlier a little bit about the FDA. They had some things, I'm trying to think back now, where at one point early in this, it was either this year or last year, the FDA was talking about, hey, we're moving to neural networks. Everyone's talking about it. Everyone's doing it. That's it. We're switching all of pharmaceutical evaluations and medicinal products. We're moving this all to AI now. Synthetic data, neural networks, the works. And then that was at the strategic, sort of like director level and above. And then the biostatisticians came in and said, no, we're not going to accept a drug that used a black box until we understand what the inferences are on that, okay? So there's been some really interesting conversations over the last year with regulators, with pharma companies, trying to understand how they can use these novel technologies. Okay, I still have time. Okay. So now I'm going to give you some examples. I kind of hinted, but I'll give you some more just to kind of motivate the why, okay? In my opinion, a lot of those things, those are a topic in themselves. Like differential privacy is a full presentation easily, okay? Synthetic data, same thing. So let's look at some of these areas why statistics are so important in the field. Okay, and again, I'm motivating this very much from the health side of things. Okay, so this is not new. All right, historical trials. So you've probably heard of it as retrospective data. Okay, basically you go to a hospital, they're collecting information about you, take that data set, and hey, now if I have a clinical trial, but I know that this is the better treatment, the next sort of level. I don't really want to, get a whole bunch of placebos and give them something that isn't, up to a certain standard, okay, certain standard of care. But what if I can go into a historical database and look at, certain profiles? So I'm going to look for, the same sort of genders, the same racial mix of people, as well as the drugs they're taking, as well as comorbidities, so the different diseases they have, and collect an appropriate sample of data and use that as my control arm. Okay, so I'm going to compare these people to real people, not synthetic. Okay, this is classic. This is already being done. There's lots of math that's been developed for this. We're good. Then we have something called, I'm going to call it virtual arm. These terms vary a little bit. They're not necessarily standard, but this is the one that I liked. So now the idea is let's compare. So again, same thing. You're giving drugs to someone and you want to compare to a virtual control arm is what they call it. Okay. So now we're using prediction in this case. Again, this is pretty well established because the math is well established. We're using regressions, we're using generalized linear models, et cetera. These are things that are well understood, well studied in biostatistics. So nothing's new here. Okay. The next one is where it starts turning a little bit. Okay. Now, this was originally presented, and there's a paper about this, and I had to go, because this is a startup company, I had to go look at what this was. I had to pull up these 3-4 papers that they wrote to understand what they were actually doing, because they described it as this brand new AI generated thing. Okay, it was like, whoa, AI generated, what is this? Can we trust this? We're going to replace the control arm with some AI generated synthetic data. It wasn't clear from the marketing material. Okay, but they've published papers, so we can go take a look. Now, why did they publish papers? The primary reason is they wanted drug approval. Okay, or I shouldn't say drug approval, but they wanted regulatory approval to use this to evaluate drugs. Okay, it ends up what they're using is a Bayesian model. Oh, okay, it's Bayesian statistics. Okay, good. It's not quite the AI as they describe it. Okay, but it's a good, to me, it's a good indicator of what we're seeing in the space. Okay, yes, people are throwing the term AI around. It's statistics. Okay, that's what it is. But there are methods like these neural networks that are uncertain, but the regulators aren't approving those. Okay, they're approving the ones that you have a good mathematical paper that explains and proves the inference. Okay, good stuff. That I'm glad to see that personally, to be quite honest, because these are drugs that we take. Okay, all right. So that's a sort of a good story in that one, I would say. Now I'm going to describe something called a digital twin. So we won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's just another good example to kind of, you can kind of see where AI is, again, in quotes, where AI is being used. So a digital twin, the basic idea is you have some sort of simulated version of something. So the easiest example I know of is actually in like a wind turbine. Okay, I'm going to create a version of this wind turbine digitally. And then I'm going to run simulations ahead of time to say, okay, well, let's see what the stress levels are. Let's see how it, the wind in this direction might, twist the blades a certain way. I want to see how fast it'll spin until it fails. But these are simulations. What a digital twin does is it ties that actual wind turbine to the digital version of itself to have a constant feedback loop. Okay. That's where things get interesting, because now you're seeing it happen and you're trying to update your model constantly to actually reflect reality. And therefore you now have a better chance of predicting a true failure, for example. Okay. So they use these for things like failure rates, huge. They were talking huge infrastructure projects, right? Imagine a ginormous wind farm. These things are massive. Okay. But they also want to do things like tweak all the parameters so that you get the most energy out of the wind turbine. That's another big thing that they do. They've lots of studies have shown that they can, really push up efficiencies using a digital twin. But now let's turn this back to healthcare, okay? What are we going to do? We're not going to have, there are people that want a digital twin of the human body, okay? But it's actually working much better. Current pilot studies and current work is very focused on a specific organ, for example. Okay, and I'll give a couple examples in a minute. So what you'll do is you're doing a bit of things. Some of it is going to be the AI statistical, but it's actually enhancing this physical, think classical physics, physical modeling with the equations of blood volume and blood flow, et cetera. So I'm thinking of the heart in this case. So you're adding a couple pieces to this. So you've got like statistics on top of this other modeling, okay? And this is done in real time. So I'll give an example. I think it's on the next slide where you'll see this a little more clearly. But the basic idea is, again, you're using statistics now to monitor for failure rates, monitor for efficiencies, and adjust. And there's a thing called a learning health system where you're getting real-time information so the doctors in the surgery know exactly what the cutting edge is. So the first example I'll give you is that it's a heart. Okay, this is a real thing. There's a company that does this. They've published papers about it where they actually have, which one is it now? CT and MR images. So the first thing they do is they'll do some scans of a person's, anatomy, in this case, the heart. They then have a 3D model they can project on a screen, they can look at, and they can start planning their surgery. Pretty cool. Okay. But it goes further than that. This is where the digital twin part comes in. While they're doing the surgery, and I forget which kind of surgeries now, I don't have it. I don't know if I wrote it down. I don't remember what these things stand for, but anyway, if you know heart stuff, it's there. But what they're doing is while they're doing the surgery, they're still taking imaging, and the digital twin is there on screen, giving them real-time information, predicting outcomes. So if they see, maybe the heart or the blood flows dropping or the blood pressure is dropping, for example, again, they're scanning this heart, they're seeing what's going on. They can start predicting in real time the potential. And again, it's much more accurate than this forecasting, like from when I looked at the heart a month ago, it's real time. Pretty cool, right? And again, lots of math, very well established. Another interesting one was a diabetes. So there's two ways they could do this. I saw two different papers where they were doing this. They had basically when you have one of these devices that's giving you, checking your glucose levels and giving you insulin. Again, like I said, there's two versions. One is the biomedical version where they model the actual pancreas, and the other one is more of a systems level view. I'm looking at all of your body system and I'm modeling that as opposed to the physical anatomy. Okay, so it's usually it's a bit of a combination of both. But again, they're using prediction, they're using statistics to try and draw this. And they're getting regulatory approval for these things, which means they're going through that full regulatory process where biostatisticians are like crunching the numbers and feeding all this evidence back to the regulator. And the last one, oh yeah, this was a cool one because it was actually related to sports medicine. Yeah, this was one in Switzerland where they were looking at the anatomy and basically the biomechanical of like someone running. Okay. Anyway, I thought that was kind of cool, but I won't spend a lot of time on that. All right. So that's all I really wanted to give you is a little bit of motivation, because I think the most interesting thing is when you talk about it from a clinical trial, drug development, regulatory perspective, because you're talking about real people and real health issues. And so the statistics here have to be sorted out. It's not just enough to use a neural network model. You have to do more. So for us, in terms of next steps, as I mentioned before, we're looking at this we start from the statistical analysis and we're adding things to it. Okay. We want a certain, statistical inference. We need to prove these things. How can we do it using some of these novel technologies? Okay. How do we build trust in this? Well, quite frankly, in a lot of these cases, and at least in the health side, it's still math. The people are doing mathematical proofs. They're actually, yes, there are jobs, there are careers after in statistics. But it is true. Like these are important things, and these neural networks, these are complex systems. How do we, there's so many, I think, interesting things. If you're familiar with Tibrashani's work, for example, statistical machine learning, this is the next level of that. Like these neural networks are crazy complicated. What can we do with them? What can we do in terms of the statistical inferences, making sure that they're safe, making sure they're giving us the results we think they are. ChatGPT is fun because it gives you language, but this is more about like healthcare outcomes. I've already said the second one as well, statistical inference. So I mentioned this already. So this is what the EMA is looking at. Do they need to know the neural network? Can they just have an evaluation framework that looks at the outputs? Obviously, a lot of companies are hoping that's the case because, quite frankly, the math is complex. But there's a debate right now. The last year, there's been many, many discussions, many roundtables with the EMA and the FDA trying to look at what are the expectations going forward, right? If we're going to do drug development, we're going to use some sort of neural network in there. How are we going to evaluate it? And it's an unsolved right now. The examples I gave you were ones where they are actually, when you look behind the marketing material and you say, okay, it's AI, and you find, oh, it's a Bayesian model. Oh, okay, great. That's math I can understand. Okay. Whereas a lot of these things, it's a lot of big words. But again, I don't want to undervalue, what's being done in terms of neural networks. It's complex. There's some amazing results. ChatGPT is a clear example of that. But the reality is there's still a very strong place for math. And finally, for us as a private company, we work with the pharma companies. We work with the FDA, the EMA. We're supporting them with new novel insights. So we have a lot of biostatisticians that work with us. But we're also building platforms. We have to make this easy for companies to use, right? So we don't just do, we don't sit there and do math all day. We're writing code and we're building entire platforms to do both privacy and this trustworthy AI, whatever that means. Rebalancing data sets, introducing transformations to the data to rebalance and eliminate bias, but in a way that's statistically proven, not just throwing, random neural networks at it. We're doing it in a very sophisticated mathematical way. So with that, I will end there. Are there any questions? I think I gave enough time for questions. Yeah, I did good. Perfect. Thank you. 10 minutes. You got 10 minutes. That's it. Not as many questions. 10 minutes. Am I supposed to be on Zoom to see if people are asking on here? I can? Okay, I'll do that. can find it.
Oh, it was like the top row, becoming bigger.
Hold on, I'll exit the. Oh, is it minimized? Ah, oh, okay. See, I need help. Zoom. I work for a tech company. I still can't figure out Zoom. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. On regulation, I'm asking for an opinion. Why there is so much haste in this area to regulate AI? Obviously, you mentioned EU. There was a summit in the UK just last week or weekend.
Yep.
And Biden just did something. Canada is doing. I just haven't seen this early regulation in any other emerging industry, even the internet. Like, it seems like people are very pessimistic what harm this thing can do. More focused on the harm than the potential.
Yep, I'm so glad you asked it in that way, because we deal with this all the time. As a privacy company, privacy analytics, right? That's typically where people lean, is the risks, right? Not the benefits. And I have a problem with that as well, to be honest. So if you look at the TBS guidance I mentioned, I'm going to be giving them feedback, and that's part of it. I felt like when I read it, it was so negative and so much about the risk that no one's going to use it. No one in government's going to use ChatGPT after reading this guidance, because it's 100% about the risk. They literally ask things like, have you checked that the data set, or sorry, that the model, so let's say ChatGPT, let's be honest, that's what they're talking about. Have you checked that to make sure that it's not using copyrighted information in its training? How would I know that if I'm using ChatGPT, right? So I think part of it is, so it was about, I want to say 3 years ago now, the OECD put together a council that actually looked at, and this was before ChatGPT, but they had already put together sort of a policy framework for looking at risks with AI, we'll call it. Okay, the new buzzword. I've been through all the stages, by the way, like it's like stages of grief. You know, I came out of school, it was math, then it was statistics, then it was machine learning, then it was data science, now it's AI. It just keeps changing. I'm still doing the same job though. But the framework is good, and it's actually the basis for the EU sort of risk-based approach. So they did a lot of evaluation, and they put together this really neat, I'm forgetting the details here, but they put together a policy framework to say, okay, when does this impact people? Ultimately, that's what they were all, that's the sort of the core. I used to have it in this or a couple slides later, but unfortunately I'm on the PDF right now, so I don't have it. But it's like a framework to look at impact on society, impact on people, impact on human rights, ultimately the planet, etc. And so they put together what I think is actually a really good framework, and they evaluated different risks, and that's how they came out with the AI Act, EU AI Act. Bit of a long mouthful there. And so that's how they did it, in a very risk-based way, which I thought was appropriate. It was like, okay, look, if you're going to use this in the case I gave, the software as a medical device, it makes sense that you'd have concerns, right? This could kill someone. Okay, let's make sure it's regulated properly. So in that case, they said, all right, risk assessments. To me, that's fine. I think that made a lot of sense, to be honest. And in fact, it's already the way we regulate these things at the FDA and EMA level. But there's a whole bunch where they just said, no, you're not doing that. And most of them were, if I remember correctly, like social scoring, and I want to say facial recognition, but I could be wrong. So they're trying to regulate, like the intrusion of privacy based on, the fundamental human rights, essentially. But the problem is that there's a negativity bias. So when I worked at the Privacy Commissioner's office, this is all you get. All you hear about are breaches and misuses of data. There's all this other stuff going on, but all you see is, so this, I'll give you my own personal take on this. This is just me, okay? Data protection authorities are their own body. They look at risks. They're lawyers, so they're focused on avoiding risks. But human rights, in fact, there's a risk-benefit piece. So if privacy is a human right, which is not necessarily in Canada, but at the UN level it is, okay, and in Europe it's a human right, there are actually a bunch of other human rights. Okay, there's some that are called positive human rights and negative human rights. Privacy is a negative human right because you're trying to avoid something, a negative outcome, okay? So why don't we ever do exactly that? The debate right now, which I think is fascinating, you've got the health regulators in Europe that are now debating with data protection authorities on something called European Health Data Space. After COVID, they recognize we need to centralize our access to health data. So every member state, like France has already built one, in fact, they're pooling all their data together in a pseudonymous way, meaning nobody's names are in it, okay? And now they're going to be able to do population health statistics, all kinds of great stuff. So to prevent the next pandemic or respond to the next pandemic, okay? Great initiative. This is actually a regulation. So there's debate going on between, the benefits versus the risks, which I think is phenomenal because it's all public and we're all seeing it. But otherwise in Canada, you're having the same thing going on and it becomes political. You hear people's, think of, I'm going way too far on this question, but it's one that I love. You think of COVID and if people are familiar, Apple and Google work together to have this app that you could download. And if someone in the room got COVID, I wouldn't know who, but I would get an alert saying, by the way, someone who you were in contact with last week, they had COVID, right? And everyone said it was such a great thing. There was I won't say her name just so I don't get her in trouble, but it was public anyway. It was published. I just don't want to misspeak in how I present this, but there was a leading privacy scholar in Canada who's in Ottawa. You can probably figure it out now. You know who I'm talking about. And she said, hey, this is all great. It's great that we're putting privacy and we're thinking about these things. However, let's not forget that data of who had COVID and that I was in contact, wouldn't that be great for the Public Health Agency of Canada so that they can determine what the risk levels are, who needs vaccine campaigns, who needs vaccines more than others, et cetera? Like those risk factors need to go back to the health agencies so that they can make informed decisions. They need the statistics. They don't need the individual necessarily, but they need to know the statistics. But that wasn't part of that Google, Apple alerting system, which I think was a big, big miss. And she brought it up. So I said, I just gave 3 things away about her. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It was in an op-ed. It was a great, or an interview. It was really good. Anyway, I'll stop there because I could keep going on and on. But I agree with you 100%. Yes.
I think I can ask something.
You have to come over here so they can hear you on.
So working in the last few years on this topic, my assessment is that 90% of the research on this field is about risk, whatever it means, and maybe 10% about data utility. So if you look, especially if you look at the papers written by computer scientists, this is always about risk. Recently, statisticians started to look at what does it mean from the statistical inference point of view. What is the effect on data utility? But I agree, this is risk.
Yeah. And I mean, you think of it from a financial perspective, in terms of finance, we have risk models as well, and that makes sense. But it's trying to find that balance point about, what risk level is okay, when should we, right? It's a big debate, but I'm definitely on the technology, the statistical side. I'm okay to have my data used as a statistic. I'm not worried about that, but some people are. And that's the problem, at least when we talk about privacy, is that, it's very personal, right? What I think is private information may not be the same. You may not want your statistics out there, right? I don't want to be part of that statistic. So you get into this pretty deep debates, which make it hard to put math numbers to it, right? To say, this is an okay risk level. We're going to use differential privacy and we're going to turn this into a risk metric. And people say, I don't want any risk. And I've seen that debate many times before. I was actually on a Superior Court of California. I was an expert witness and I brought in all my statistics, and I'll tell you, it was just like the TV shows, getting crushed because, I said there was a non-zero probability, oh no, like that was a bad thing. Like you have to remind people when you're talking to lawyers and policymakers, you have to speak their language. You have to say, no, there's no risk. There's a probability, but there's no risk, because they don't understand the math part. You have to speak their language, right? You have to speak the law, and the law might say, I forget, depends where this was California, so I forget what exactly the law said, but you have to speak in that language so they understand what you're saying. Because if you, like the scientist on TV, if you say, well, of course, there's always a possibility that an alien's going to come out of nowhere, like you're done. That's it. You're literally yelled at and shut down. Like it's quite the experience. There's a question online here. I'll just take a quick read. How can regulatory bodies adapt in relation to one another? How does that affect the idea of social scoring? Yes, interesting. So adapt into, so this, I'm not entirely sure, but I'll take my stab at this. So there are several things going on. So in the privacy space, data protection authorities meet annually and they try and coordinate. So in Canada, we have a thing called adequacy status, where basically our law is substantially similar. We protect data enough that we can get, yep, you're good. You can work with the data of European citizens, essentially. Okay, so there's some coordination in that respect. Our new Bill C that I forgot the name of, which is embarrassing, but whatever. Our new privacy laws are sort of somewhat modeled with GDPR. So there's these kind of conversations. I should mention there's two bodies, right? There's justice that does, writing of the laws, and then there's the regulator, like the privacy commissioner, that enforce the law. So they're two separate pieces, but everyone's weighing in, trying to figure out what that is. So internationally, that's hard enough within Canada because you have these panels and you have politicians. And during COVID, we saw a lot of that, different political parties coming out of the woodworks talking about these topics. So it becomes political as well. Then you have international collaboration. The GDPR, I forget which magazine it was. I don't think it was The Economist. I thought it was, but I couldn't find the cover. And they were saying it's probably the best export, the highest exporting thing that the EU has produced in the last, whatever number of years, because everyone is looking at GDPR to update their regulations. India has done it. China has done it. They're all looking to that as the model. Now, if you ever look at the GDPR, it's like 500 pages of legalese, not fun to read, okay? But everyone's taking sort of a version of that. So that's happening. Now we go to the EMA and FDA. This is what a lot of companies are telling them, saying, hey, I'm dealing with, submission at the EMA, but you're asking for something different. Can we please coordinate? So they're getting feedback from industry. They're trying to work together. That's how I'm taking C27. Thank you. Oh my goodness, I couldn't remember that. So that's one of the things but I mean, it is a very complicated thing because politics get involved, views come involved, this whole debate about whether or not privacy should be a human right in Canada, whereas it already is. It's in the UN Charter, et cetera, et cetera. So these things get really, really complicated. I was talking to someone just the other day, and it was interesting perspective because I always thought that's something we would want. As an international company, IQVIA is everywhere in the world. We play this game at work where we I wonder if IQVIA is in this country, and we do a search to see if they're and it's crazy, they're everywhere because they're small, but they're everywhere. So you would think we would want more harmonization. We want regulatory work together, have the same thing. It'd be so much easier, but it doesn't matter to us. We're consultants at the end of the day. We're in a country, we'll follow those laws and those interpretations. It is what it is. Now, in terms of social scoring, that's a tough one. So people probably have heard of this. I lost the mouse now. So I don't know the details, and I don't want to misrepresent or misjudge, but there's been talk of some sort of social scoring system that sort of exists in China. I don't know the details. People talk about it all the time. I have family in China, so I could probably ask them a little bit more, but there's been a lot of hype around it from the Western side, trying to understand what that is. It's a different context, right? It's a very different system. So it's hard. I think this is the part of the challenge as well. It's one thing for the EU to say, look, this is not okay for us, but in a different country with different norms and regulations, it's a different thing. It's not really my place to say. And that does make it hard, though, again, to coordinate, how do we want these things to work? Privacy and AI risks they're soft things. So the statistician in me wants to look at the stats problems. That's what I want to work on, but I can't help but have to deal with this as well. All right. That's all I can say for that one. Trying to avoid stepping on any landmines here.
So one of the things you mentioned, cutoff time, which I found very insightful. You talk about AI, this is just the statistics, right? And it's absolutely true. It shows that, I remember this started less than 10 years ago. It's people were hiring people, experts for machine learning. And I looked at it, what is the statistician you need, right?
Yep.
It's what we machine learning. So it's absolutely true. But don't you think that field has evolved into its own thing, the same way that engineering has evolved relative to physics? So you can say, engineering is all physics. It's true, but hasn't it become its own thing? Not to mention the fact that a lot of cool research is how actually, for example, a human child learns, and let's figure that out, and then figure out how a machine can do the same thing. So as much as I really like what you said, and it's actually this confirmation bias, it's huge insight. I feel like that machine learning or AI has become its own field of inquiry.
Yep, and I agree. I'm speaking to my audience, but I'm also a statistician, so I'm also biased in that sense. But ultimately, if you look at someone I hire and I work with a lot of people that are machine learning or AI scientists. That's what I'm classified within IQVIA. I'm a director of AI science. okay? My background is math, engineering, and statistics. So the difference to me is exactly as you described. It's more like engineering. It's how do I use these tools? Which is fine. It's totally fine. A lot of the, like you look at ChatGPT and this attention thing, like I said, it's basically just a weighting matrix. It's math at the end of the day, but they're not looking at it from math perspective, and it almost unshackles them in a way, right? Because suddenly they don't have to think about the math. They can just think about how do I chain these things together? How do I add this, I draw a line between these two nodes and suddenly it's a whole new thing. I add this attention matrix and suddenly it's a whole new thing. And it's brilliant. I mean, the algorithms, you look at back propagation. So if you ever hear this term back propagation for neural networks, it's gradient descent, but it's an algorithm to achieve it efficiently, right? So it's gradient descent ultimately they're implementing, but there's a whole computer science component to it that is quite brilliant, in fact. And the fact that they've renamed things is super frustrating for me trying to understand what they're doing. But on the flip side, it's like, yeah, I see why they're doing it, because it allows them to innovate, allows them to say, okay, I'm going to call this attention because I'm trying to get this AI in quotes, to focus in on certain things that I know are more valuable because I've done some training on bigger data sets. Like the classic example is translation, right? If I see le and the, French le and English the, a lot of times in sentences, and I see the structure so much that it starts to come, oh, I'm going to weight that higher. So focus in on that. I think that's brilliant, right? No math, but it is math. It's implemented as math. So I agree with you. I actually started in engineering before I transferred into math. And the engineering was very much, take these tools and build something. And that's what they're doing in computer science, and they're doing machine learning. And I have a lot of people I work with like that. The only caution I'm going to say, and why I tend to say, it's basically statistics, is because when you get into certain areas, you really have to remind yourself it's not just hacking something together. Like some of these things need to be proven correctly in order for me to get drug approval, for example. Like that is actually very important. In a lot of cases, ChatGPT, I don't care. I don't need any statisticians there, but I do need them on the drug approval process. Right? Because I need to know that this is accurate, that this thing that I'm getting, this number, what are the standard errors around that? I actually need to know that. And the work we've been doing together has been around that. I'm going to add noise to this to make it private, but I want to make sure it's giving me actual confidence interval at the end of the day, because I need to know this is data I can give to the pharma company, right? So I agree with you entirely. Absolutely. Again. Thank you for the question. We're past time now, so
So we go to the
Yeah.
other questions. So the speaker.
thank you, everyone.